So thank you very much for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Markus Baier and I'm from the University of Padua. And the title is slightly different, so it's improving metal additive part design and final part precision. And to show you, there is a problem. It's not going on. Now it works. So the pointer is not working actually. So first to show you, this is the small outline. So I will give you a short introduction, actually, which artifact we used to find out some feedback. Then I will show you some small strategies or points which X-Ray-CT can actually be used to give feedback to part design and process. So there are other ways, but due to time, I just show a few. And then we jump to the conclusions. So to start, basically, as you see here on the left, this is basically the designed artifact. We called it spyglass artifact because it looks like the spyglass from a pirate. And it exhibits basically 8 hollow cylinders, and we are mostly interested in the internal features and the internal surfaces and so on, because due to the additive nature, we can actually produce this kind of features quite easily. So we have different channel diameters and overall lengths of 75 millimeters. So often problems in additive, as you know already, is basically at one hand we have different surface roughness depending on the angle of your build. So for example, in the vertical angles, in the vertical direction, you have a much lower roughness than on the top. I'm talking at the moment about as-built parts. If they're post-processed, this changes, of course. Another aspect is basically that you can have a quite located porosity, which might be due to a bad overlap in the hatching or other problems during the process, or also the design and the alignment. And another effect is, of course, we need definitely new approaches to actually assess this kind of artifacts and defects we see during the production, and maybe to actually compensate it already during the design stage. So to actually jump to the feedback which can be given by CT. First, I'll show you a short case of the porosity. So as you see, basically this is the full part in the porosity. So what you can see here is basically the different small pores which were detected by X-ray CT. And you see they actually reassemble quite perfectly the shape of the part. So what you basically see, most of them are round, but we also have some slightly misshaped pores which are due to the laser passes. The rest of them might be inert gas or during powder production, which was entrapped gas. So what you can basically do with the data from X-ray CT, you can actually plot the edge distance against the porosity, and you see a really nice distribution curve, which actually corresponds quite well to the intermediate position between the border hatching and the infill hatching. So basically this is already one result which can be given to the process to check actually during the design and the setup of the process if you have sufficient overlap between your border hatch and your infill hatch. Then another thing which can be done with CT is, of course, deviation to nominal analysis. However, in this case, it's quite crucial how you align your obtained volume data against your CAD model, your STL file, and so on, because this can have, first of all, a tremendous influence on your outcome. And of course, it depends what you want to evaluate. So in our case, we are more focused on the smaller channel diameters, because this is a first step to actually design a microchannel part. So we will go further to smaller channels. So we actually aligned, in this case, only the top 3 cylinders. And as you can see, due to the process and the removal from the platform, we had slight warpage in the part itself. And for this reason, for example, for the bigger channel diameters, as you introduce deformation due to heat stress and so on, you have actually a warping, and this is why it looks at one side red, at the other blue, so you have high deviations. But for the smaller channels, it looks fine. However, if you look in the inside, you can actually have quite high deviations. So what are we looking at the moment is basically the sealing of the channel inside. So a next step for feedback in this case, we were thinking how to actually assess this kind of problem and how to characterize this kind of defect. So as every one of you knows, it's a quite complex process. So you have always different error sources and different contributors to the error. So to actually achieve and to be able to give feedback, we started to think about, first of all, it's a huge amount of data. So you, at some point you have to break it down into smaller pieces to be able to evaluate it in a proper way. So first of all, we selected in the different cylinders diameters, we selected a region of interest, and which is basically denoted here in the black and the red angle. And the point was now how to actually get some information about only the top ceiling and this kind of defect in particular. So what we've done then was basically aligning our channels in one section perpendicular to the channel direction, and to extract actually stacked images of 780 projections in a spacing of our voxel resolution, which was in this case 10 micrometer. So what we then tried to apply, or what we applied, is actually we did a coordinate transformation of each of the images by selecting only the center and the inner channel of our images, to also reduce the amount of data which needs to be processed, because at some point it gets quite time consuming due to the size and the amount of images to process. So for that reason, we did a coordinate transformation in this case from Cartesian to polar coordinates. And what you basically get, as some of you might know, it's also applied in surface software to do some form removal and so on. So you can basically roll out your surface profile on a straight line. And as it turns out, you basically see quite nicely this kind of peaks and shapes from your dross and sag deformation in this case. So to further proceed, we basically cropped the files again. And what we obtained is basically when you restack each of the cross sections behind each other in a nice way, you can basically see on the top here, you can basically see the stacked slices, and they reassemble quite well the ceiling of the channels. If you do this now for different channel diameters, you can basically see that the dross formation, so the really spiky parts of your form and surface, actually stays at almost the same height, but the sag defect becomes more pronounced. So basically your dross formation vanishes inside or wanders inside your overall sag defect. So the question now is how to actually assess this. And of course you have to think about, you have a really high variation, but you have to use or apply it during the design stage, or you want to apply it during the design stage. So we decided actually to calculate the mean and the standard deviation of all the stacked profiles. And what you can see here basically in black is the mean defect profile obtained for the upper ceiling, and in light gray is basically the standard deviation in each data point we had. So as you can see, for example, in the region where you have mostly sag defect, your standard deviation is also much lower compared to the spiky area where you have the highly fluctual defects due to the dross formation, which is basically in the more overhanging regions. What you can see already here is that you actually have a quite nice symmetrical distribution around the vertical axis. So basically both peaks appear at basically the same distance from the 90 degrees. And you have the highest variability in between 45 to the left and 45 degrees to the right. So which is basically exactly the area where you usually would put supports in your overhangs, but in the internal channels, of course, you want to avoid it because you cannot remove it afterwards. So what you cannot see here, but I will tell you, you can actually see a strong dependence between the channel diameter and the sag and dross formation as contributors to this kind of curve. As you might have seen it on the previous slide, if I go back one, basically you can see it here on the profiles as the dross vanishes into the sag defect. So how to actually model this or give it as feedback to the design? We started to try to model at least the form in the first place. So we applied a multi-function mixture model to actually model our deviation, our mean deviation we found. And at the moment we are applying 3 separate functions, which in this case are Gaussians, to first of all reassemble or to be able to separate the sag defect and the dross formation from each other. Because of course you cannot give this directly as feedback to the design, because if you introduce it as like this in the design stage, you might overcompensate and you actually get a circular shape which is deformed in the other direction. So this is basically the first trial, and we have in future works we will basically reprint the part and actually check how it turns out, because so far we couldn't find other studies which were actually trying to model this kind of defect. So to conclude, basically, I've showed you 3 small parts as feedback for the AM process and design, but this is also something which can be applied to any other model. So this was just an artifact, but you can basically apply the same methods for any shape of your part if the size is small enough, as mentioned by my speakers before me. So what you basically can do with CT is it enables actually the extraction in one shot of highly valuable information, not only for design, but also for the process. For example, speaking of the dependency of porosity, which it was entrapped between the 2 different hatchings. You can also actually assess defects in a more generalized way to feed it back to the design stage and to actually obtain first-time right parts. That's all we hope for at the moment or in future. And for that reason, the future work will also include the parameterization of the mixture model to actually feed it back with different screws to actually apply or adjust it to your needs. So for example, if you want to avoid the sag defect in total, you can enhance the contribution in the deviation of the mixture model to reduce the sag defect. Or if you want to have lower roughness or lower dross formation, you can also screw or give the weight to the dross formation function. With this, I want to conclude, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Markus. Questions from the audience? And then we have one there.
Yeah, so back on slide 7.
Yep.
It appears that there is a stripe that goes across the middle. Actually, you can see it in that case too.
On 7 here.
Yes. So there is a stripe that kind of goes across the middle.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that?
Well, thanks for the question. So this is actually, we were also thinking, because it appeared quite strange, but actually it is not. So if you assume how the part was built, in the regions where you have the red or the big deviations, you basically melted the powder which was not below. So this established basically some virtual supports for the successive layers. So basically, if you come close to the vertical, so the closing of the channel, you basically have a self-supporting structure due to the high defects in the lower layers.
So what's I guess the distance between the 2 reds? Is that about a millimeter?
No, it's much less.
It's much less. Okay.
Yeah, it's much less.
Yeah.
So it's a few hundred micron, 200-300 micron actually. Okay. The problem is if you roll it out in the structure, it just appears much larger than it is. So it's due to the transformation.
In the EO system, they tell you don't go over a millimeter unsupported structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what you're saying.
Okay. Thanks.
So during your scanning, the work size
Sorry, I didn't.
What's the voxel size?
The voxel size. In this case, it was 10.5 micrometer. So as you can imagine, the part was quite big, so we had to scan it in several sections, and then we stitched it together. to obtain the full size of the part.
So in this case, is overlapping the staging.
Yeah, so basically we calculated our field of view, and according to this, we basically selected the scanning strategy in the CT, and we did it as a batch scan. So we started from the bottom to the top, and in each scan, it's just the moving stage, just positioned the part a little bit lower.
Exactly scanning some overlapping.
Yeah, yeah, of course. For the otherwise you cannot perform the stitching, or you can.
The overlapping area from the top, we introduce some. How's the accuracy of the overlapping to really affect the true porosity, for example?
What do you mean by accuracy of overlapping?
You scan this portion and then when you scan another portion, somehow some overlapping.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the overlapping error is very, for example, the porosity really affect the true porosity over there. So being error introduced during because of this overlapping stitching process. Of course,
if you apply stitching or and so forth, you introduce some errors. In this case, we introduced actually the conical sections. If I go back one slide, so as you can see here, we had between each cylinder we added a conical section. So this conical section was always visible in both, in the first scan and the second scan, in the subs and so on. So this was our first alignment. And of course, regarding the porosity, you introduced some errors. But for that reason, we also did an evaluation of the porosity separately for each volume we obtained and for the overall part we obtained. And it showed only really small deviations, which were more or less negligible. But you're right, you always introduce some errors and you have to account for that.
We have another one there.
You said that you might want to try to compensate the error, but couldn't you then introduce all the surface porosity you showed earlier into the part of the part actually? That you try to compensate that you get all the surface porosity?
Well, this might be, but the point in this case is to compensate basically the sag and dross formation. But the porosity was actually mostly located between the border hatch and the infill. So inside the part there was almost no porosity. So you're right, but we are also quite sure when we're able to avoid the dross formation, actually, we would also reduce the porosity in this part, because the dross formation is basically due to the adhesion of loose powder in a bad way. So basically you partially sinter your powder and it gets attached, and that's why you see it as, or that's why it appears as porosity in the CT volume. So when you basically can get rid of the dross formation itself, it usually also, or we assume we will find out soon, it should also reduce the porosity entrapped inside your part.
We have another one, the last one maybe.
Yeah. Can you please share again how you plan to compensate for the second loss? I didn't quite get it.
Sure. It's really slow. So basically, this is only a part of our channel circumference. So what will basically be future work is to embed this in the full 360 degrees line, and then basically to parameterize in a way that we can basically transform it back to Cartesian coordinates. So to actually create kind of a free-form shape, which can be applied to any CAD software, to basically use it as a misshaped circle, basically. So what you would do at the end is you take this shape and you extrude it, for example, for 10 millimeters, if you want a channel of 10 millimeters, and you have the same. This is kind of a downside because we have high variability in the AM process. So you will have one channel which has the same misshape on the top, but when you process it in your process, it will basically sag or tend to bend down and create a circular shape. That's the main aim. Oh, I'm not saying this is the perfect shape already, but it's the first trial and we have to start somewhere.
But would you remove away the support structure? I think it's related to the earlier question.
Yeah, but in this case, you would remove the support structure. So it would actually sink down, But the idea is to let it sink down in a way that it reassembles basically the initial expected shape, which was circular in this case, for example. So we want to deform the starting form to arrive at the desired form, which is a circle. But you're right, you would remove basically the self-supporting nature.
Just a very last question.
We can also discuss later.
Okay.
Okay. So, thanks.
So let's thank Markus again.